Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here. Thank you. At the Hammer Museum. I want to welcome you all to tonight's Hammer Forum on Deconflating LA's homeless and mental health crises. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of the Rosenblum family. Tonight's the second of a four-part series we're doing on the housing crisis in LA. For this iteration, we're going to focus on two things that many people cite as causing homelessness: mental illness and drug addiction. When I talk to people about the homeless crisis, they often start talking about inadequate mental health care and the lack of mental institutions in California as a major cause of homelessness. Or in a similar vein, I've heard people blame the rise in dangerous street drugs like meth and fentanyl as causing homelessness. The association between drugs, mental illness, and people experiencing homelessness has become so strong that it might blind us to understanding the political and economic issues that underlie the housing crisis. It's also a chicken and egg kind of question. Did unhoused people who are suffering from mental illness start experiencing mental illness and that drove them to homelessness? Or did living on the streets cause or amplify their mental problems? The same goes for drug addiction. Either way, it's important that if we really want to help people experiencing homelessness and if we really want to end homelessness in Los Angeles, we need to be able to separate out the component parts that contribute to the problem so we can see them clearly in order to find effective, successful solutions. Tonight we have the voices of 5 experts who will talk to us about these issues in detail. Before I introduce them, I want to invite you to our other upcoming programs on the housing crisis. The next Hammer Forum on the LA housing crisis is July 11th, and for that panel we ask, where's the money? Because in 2016, LA voters voted in a bond measure designed to generate more than $1 billion over 10 years to create affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness. 6 years later, where's the housing? And what are the barriers to building more housing in LA? In August, we'll talk about what works. What are the answers to this ongoing but ultimately solvable crisis? I also want to encourage you to watch or listen to the first night of the series, in which we attempted to give a kind of overall primer to the giant topic of the housing crisis, and we tried to identify and answer the most common questions and misconceptions about the unhoused while drilling down to the roots of the current housing crisis in Southern California. The video is available on the Hammer Channel website, and it was a really great program, so I highly recommend that you check it out. So now to introduce our 5 experts. First, you'll hear from Cece Smith, a woman in Highland Park who's currently experiencing homelessness. And then I'll bring up Anna Scott, a veteran journalist who's focused on housing and homelessness for over 10 years. She's a reporter for public radio station KCRW, and she also reports regularly on homelessness for NPR's national programs. Anna Scott created and hosted KCRW's podcasts City of Tents, Veterans Row, and Samaritans. Before that, she produced the news programs Press Play, To the Point, and Which Way LA, and wrote for Bloomberg Businessweek, the LA Times, and other local publications. So Anna's going to moderate a discussion with Jon Sherin, former director of the LA County Department of Mental Health, Pete White, executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and Dora Leong Gallo, president and CEO of a community of friends, about the obstacles faced by mentally ill communities and by unhoused people and the policies that could help. Dora Leong Gallo has worked in community development for over 30 years. Since 2003, she has served as president and CEO of a community of friends, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer whose mission is to end homelessness through the provision of quality, permanent, supportive housing for people with mental illness. In her role, Ms. Gallo is responsible for the execution of their strategic priorities and is an advocate for increasing the supply of affordable homes for those most vulnerable. Under her guidance, their portfolio of housing has increased 240%. In addition to operating 43 supportive housing communities, housing over 2,600 people throughout Los Angeles and Orange County, a community of friends has expanded its work to Ventura, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. She also serves on the board of trustees of Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to increasing housing supply and advancing racial equity and building resilience. And she's the board chair for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. In addition, she's an active participant with the Supportive Housing Alliance, which is an advocacy group of supporting housing developers in LA County. Dr. Jonathan Sherin is a health and well-being activist who's worked on behalf of vulnerable populations throughout his career at local, state, and national levels. He's worked as a clinician, teacher, researcher, and administrative leader to help others with profound behavioral health challenges connect to a brighter future. In his last job, Dr. Sherin served as director of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, which is the largest public mental health system in the United States. While there, he pushed for a complete transformation of their systems, advocating fiercely for behavioral health parity, as well as payment reform, and focusing on building out community-based as opposed to institutional programs, policies, and practices. In addition, he spent over a decade working in the Department of Veteran Affairs, serving as Chief of Mental Health for the Miami VA, and as Vice Chair for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Miami. Pete White is the founding and executive director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA CAN, which is a grassroots organization working to ensure the human right to housing, health, and security are upheld in Los Angeles. Pete is a lifetime resident of South Central Los Angeles and has organized thousands of low-income people in a multitude of human rights campaigns. He co-produced the community festival Operation Skid Row, linking cultural giants like Chuck D and Public Enemy with the work of local artists and organizations to expand the collective bandwidth to produce change. Among his many accomplishments, he secured the Residential Hotel Ordinance, which is cited as the strongest tenants' rights protection in the history of Los Angeles, that protected low-income people living in residential hotels from becoming homelessness as a result of real estate speculation, market rate development, and gentrification. He has created numerous state and local laws protecting the rights of poor people facing housing displacement and discriminatory policing. And he developed strategies to pass 2 local ballot measures that we'll be discussing next month, H and HHH, resulting in a nearly $5 billion infusion of resources to build housing and provide services to homeless people. He's also featured in the critically acclaimed film Los Angeles, Skid Row is My Home, and numerous other documentaries investigating housing justice, food justice, criminal justice reform, and broad-based human rights. So we're going to start by hearing from Cece Smith in Highland Park, and then Anna, Dora, John, and Pete will have a roundtable discussion, and then take audience questions. And then I invite you all to join us outside for some coffee, tea, and cookies in the lobby, and we can talk about all of these issues some more. So without further ado, let's first hear from Cece Smith in this 4-minute interview conducted by our moderator, Anna Scott.
My name is Cece Smith. I'm staying on this lot on the corner of Avenue 64 and Marmion Way. This is what it is. It is what it is. It's kind of difficult to be homeless out here, but I try to make the best of it.
Yeah, and you've been here for a while.
About 4 years.
What effect does living unhoused have on your mental health?
Oh, it has a tremendous strain of stress, you know. A lot of the community, they put homeless people down and this and that, and they don't realize what we go through. It's not as simple and easy as they think it is, you know, because they've never been there. Like I've always said, if we had a major earthquake and all your homes were dropped and you became homeless, you guys would be coming to us. Hey, how do you guys do this? How are you surviving? A lot of people don't know where their next meal is coming from or where they're going to get something to eat or if it's going to rain, you know, or, you know, how are they going to keep warm? How are they going to keep themselves clean? You got to learn to adapt to the situation out here. Try to make myself as comfortable as possible to keep my sanity. You know, I think the page that I'm on, if I wasn't on the page that I'm on, I would be a lot like a lot of the rest of them. A lot of these people out here have mental and medical issues. And nobody is bringing that to the plate. You can't just stick people in a cracker box and say, okay, look, there's no more homeless, I solved the problem. It don't work like that.
So there's not enough resources for people with medical or
over here. There's no resources at all.
I know from interviewing you, in the past, a little bit over the years, that you've interacted with a lot of different people from different service providers, different city and county offices. What is your trust like in those organizations?
Oh, I definitely don't have no trust at all. I just want my voucher. I just want to get off this lot. I want to try to get my life back to normal. And Martha showed me on her phone that I was approved for Section 8, and it's been 6 months, and this is really just stressing me out so bad. Sometimes I feel like I just want to snap. And
Martha is with the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority?
yeah, from LASA, yes.
And is there anything right now just that you feel hopeful about? Like, have you gotten any hopeful signs from any of these service providers or?
Not one.
A lot of people think that our mental health crisis and our homelessness crisis are one and the same, and that people are falling into homelessness because of mental health issues solely. But how do you break that down?
No, that is not true. A lot of homeless people get mental health problems because they're out here. You know, for the most part, I mean, you got a few bad apples in the batch, okay? But for the most part, a lot of them go off the deep end because of being able to just survive out here is so hard. A lot of the community and homeowners think that none of us want help out here, that we're all drug addicts. That is not true. It's bullshit. The public, the community, the homeowners need to know the truth. If I get my voucher, no matter what, I'll get my 2 dogs and I'll walk till I drop, till I find a place. I don't want to be out here. I don't enjoy this. It's hard to do anything out here. Just to take a shower, even though I made one, to cook some food, it's 100 times harder than being indoors in a house that has a toilet that flushes, a shower, a tub, a sink, where you could put a refrigerator, have something cold. It's really difficult out here.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. Anna Scott, moderator this evening. Maybe we just want to, Claudia introduced everybody, but just to put faces to the names, we'll just go down the row, names. We got everybody's bios.
Yeah, Pete White with the Los Angeles Community Action Network.
Dora Leong Gallo, a community of friends.
Jon Sherin.
So, welcome. This is, as Claudia mentioned, the second conversation in a series of conversations that are happening this summer. And the goal of the whole series is to unpack some of the common questions that I think regular Angelinos have about LA's homelessness crisis. One that I definitely hear a lot is, do we have to fix our mental health system in order to fix homelessness? And that interview with Cece, I picked out to play before this particular discussion because she touched on some of the things that I would like to unpack this evening. So we're just going to jump right in, and I think that is my first question to each of you is, what do you say to that? Do we have to fix our mental health system in order to fix homelessness? You want to start, Pete? And we'll just...
I mean, that's a short answer for me. That's no. Right? I don't have much more than that.
Fair enough. We're gonna come back to you. We're gonna be
come back.
discussing
I'm
this
sure.
for a while.
I'm not afraid, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, I think if we want to keep it short, the answer is no also. You'll see the numbers that back that up in terms of who's homeless out on the streets, and it is not 100% people who are experiencing mental health crisis.
Yeah, I would agree. It's hard to follow up on Cece because she nailed so many topics, bullseye. But this is obviously a complex question. And I would say that we had to fix the mental health system for so many reasons across the board, but don't get me started.
Well, we will probably in this discussion, but why do you think it is that is such a common question? Where does the perception come from that the homelessness crisis and the mental health crisis or the holes that we have in our mental health system are one and the same?
I mean, I guess I'm going to date myself, but I've been doing this work since 1992. And the dominant narrative has always been one that suggested people were houseless because of their mental illness, because of substance abuse, or because they just weren't trying hard enough, right? It was rooted in this idea of meritocracy. Like there's enough for everyone. There's a chicken in every pot, and if you don't get it, it's because of you. And then years of policy, everything from criminalization and lacks of funding, sort of followed that logic or that illogical perspective that people were there because they wanted to be there. Never during my early years, there was no structural analysis, right? There was never, it was really weird that it took 20 years to make the houselessness crisis a housing crisis, right? Because for so many years, it was seen as an issue of charity, right? It was not seen as a justice issue. It wasn't seen as a justice of housing. It wasn't seen as an issue rooted in housing justice or economic justice or racial justice or any of these things. It was more about, those are some broken people. Can we just help them, right? And so what you had, I told you I'd have something to say at some point. I mean, so what you have is an entire system that's built on this idea, this fallacy, that it's just about broken people and not a broken system.
I also think it's visible. I think the people who might have experienced mental health crises are the ones that people see. A lot of people who are homeless for other circumstances and other reasons hide themselves pretty well. And so I think the public conflates that mental illness piece with the homelessness crisis because of that.
Yeah, and actually, I have a specific question for you, Jon, as a psychiatrist who's practiced street medicine, who ran the Department of Mental Health for LA County. I think there is a perception that there's a large number of people who are unhoused in LA who have very severe mental health issues, schizophrenia, things like that, because people are making assumptions based on what's most visible. But how common are actually serious illnesses like that, and how do you explain to people what they're seeing?
Well, this is a lightning rod topic for a lot of reasons. And what I would say is that there certainly is a significant portion of not just the homeless population, but those who are in jails, those who are revolving in and out of the hospitals and other parts of the crisis system, who have, severe persistent mental illness and are not getting access to treatment. I commissioned, when I was running the department at UCLA, to do a study and to look at the percentage of people on the street who had a primary psychotic disorder, such as schizophrenia, and had predicted, based on my experience doing street medicine, that it was going to be about 10%. It was about 10%. So there is a portion of the population who have an illness. It's not treated, and they fall out of community, again, into the streets, into the jails, and in and out of acute treatment settings. But again, going back to Cece, my new latest hero, people who spend time in the streets are enduring intense trauma. And when you're enduring intense trauma and stress, you develop mental health challenges. So we have to, of course, keep that in mind. But the fundamental question, and I think the response that we're getting about no, is that people don't fall, the majority of people are not falling into homelessness because of a mental illness. And I have to say, I've been, fighting this fight and this point for a long, long time. And you read in the newspapers and you read in studies from, USC, from UCLA previously, and they will say that, 50% of the people, 65% of the people in the streets have serious mental illness, and that does get conflated as the etiology or the reason for why they become homeless.
I can also add that homelessness is a housing problem. It's a lack of a home. It is not a mental illness issue, right? And so even at our organization, I would say more than half the phone calls and the emails that we get are from people who are looking for affordable housing, not because they have a mental health crisis.
Well, I did do a little research just to kind of bolster what you guys are saying before this, and I looked at what places in the world have the highest rates of mental illness, and Greenland was up there. Doesn't have a huge homelessness crisis, though, like a lot of American cities do. And also looked at opiate use, and the United States is up there, but so is Russia and Afghanistan, Iran, again, not known for huge homelessness crises. So that's kind of bolstering what you guys are saying, but my question coming out of it is, where do these things overlap? Is it just a matter of vulnerability? When we have a housing crisis, that's the more vulnerable people are going to be going to fall victim to that, or where are the overlaps between homelessness and the holes in our mental health care system?
Yeah, I just saw Mike's
I know.
moving. I'm like,
Pete's going to talk about housing justice, right? And he's going to talk about the systems that lead to it. And
I mean, you guys can always ignore the question. Just say what you want to say. That's a little trick from me to you.
no, go ahead.
I want to go back to the fact that we have a housing crisis here in Los Angeles also, in the greater Los Angeles community. If people had the wages to support the real estate, right, whether or not they have a disability, we wouldn't have a homeless crisis necessarily for the extent that we have. So a large part of it has to do with other systems that come into play. You mentioned the jail system and the people who are leaving our jail system with $200 and no place to go, right? So where do you expect people to go? And so I think that all these other systems are feeding into the impact that we're seeing on the streets.
I was just over here thinking first of all, hello everybody, and thanks for coming out. That's the first thing. My grandmother's probably like, do that. Just something else the first thing that you said, and I was sort of stuck there. If substance abuse was a driver of houselessness in the United States, there would be nothing but informal settlements everywhere, right? When we think about the addiction to prescription drugs and other drugs in this country, right? So it can't be, right? The same applies to mental illness. When we look at the rates, I know studies, Molly Lowry, rest in peace. Molly Lowry used to talk a lot about the rate of mental illness in the houseless community juxtaposed to the rate of mental illness in the housed community. And it was always very close, right? In the houseless community, it might be up a couple of ticks for the reasons that Dr. Sherin is saying, like one night out houseless and suffering trauma starts raveling apart your mental health, right? And so it can't be those things. But these are, and when someone says that, we'll say, damn, that's right? Like, why have we been believing that thing forever? But then the other thing, I think that's important for this conversation. Oftentimes when we have conversations about houselessness, it's always rooted in the visible houseless community. We have to stop that. We have to think about inflow into houselessness. We have to think, particularly right now, we have to think about the COVID-19 eviction cliff that's hanging. We have to think about informal settlements that are going to crop up. And so the conversation at some point has to be expanded, right? And as Dora said, and we're probably going to say 50 times tonight, it's a housing crisis situation. For 20 years, we had to fight, folks on the ground knew the drivers weren't mental illness and substance abuse. We knew it was housing affordability, housing availability, and poverty. We knew that it was really about the HUD cuts in the 70s. And I'm talking about they slashed the HUD budget from $83 billion a year down to $18 billion a year, and then created these crazy systems where there's $2 billion where cities across the country are competing for this emergency housing without replacing sort of public housing. Public housing, we lose 200,000 units in the 90s. We never replaced them. And so you see this entire disintegration of a safety net, and nothing is there to replace it, right? And there's of course much more to the story, but nothing there to replace it. And then come 83, we start seeing lots of folks houseless and, without home. And so it becomes difficult now, like it's almost like a Hobson's choice, right? And so the electorate and community is given the option: do you want housing in your community or not? And I'm sure we'll talk about NIMBY and YIMBY and all of that in a second. And folks are led to believe that we can just build enough shelters, right, for everyone who's coming. And the reality is, until we figure out how to replenish the resources going toward housing that's affordable at all levels, this crisis is just going to continue to grow. And housing, when we think about wellness, if you don't have a home, if you don't have a home community, and all of these things, it's gonna be hard to get well. And we're gonna continue to see mental illness and other things cropping up on the streets.
You guys both looked like you might want to jump in, so just go for it. You don't have to
I
wait
don't even
for
know
me.
if that was your question, but
Yeah, I don't remember the question either.
Doesn't matter.
And I think I don't know if this is disagreement. I think that there's an inadequate housing inventory, and there's housing affordability issues which are fundamental and need to be resolved. One of the things that really bothers me is waiting to get housed. We have people who are languishing in the streets, rotting in the streets, waiting in line for ridiculous amounts of time. I mean, some people will get a voucher, a HUD voucher, and it'll expire before they get housed. That's like systems insanity.
Some people in this audience, actually.
Well, okay, there you go. So one of the things that I was pushing was not just, obviously we need to build the inventory, and we're decades behind because it's been neglected for the reasons I think that Pete is articulating. But in the interim, what are we going to do to get people into less toxic conditions? Because it's just generating more and more illness. People are suffering. People are dying. When I showed up in LA County, I think there were 800, 750, 800 people who died in the street. That's more than doubled in 5 years. So what are we going to do about that? And I'm not sitting here saying that it's about shelters. I really think that many shelters are problematic for lots and lots of reasons. But we have to figure out a way, when we have a natural disaster or when we go to war, we will build temporary barracks for our military for 10,000 people in like a month. Communities. And why are we not leveraging that type of will and intensity to go after the problem and to get people into better conditions? And those are not permanent solutions, but they're getting people out of the toxic environments where they will predictably perish. And I don't know, and I've said this in Congress in DC, and I talked about it a lot at the state. This is an emergency, much like an earthquake, much like a fire, much like hurricanes, because it's a displacement of people from community. And it has to be seen that way. And FEMA, the Army Corps of Engineers, all these things need to be put out there for us to act upon. And I will also say, when I was at the county, there were a lot of us who were telling the county, this is a state of emergency. And it wasn't declared. Karen Bass came in, declared it right away. Then the county followed. Where's the state? And where's the Fed in declaring a national emergency in parts of this country, starting in the epicenter, which is right here, to move people into conditions that are not toxic, while at the same time, in parallel, we're building up housing. And the one thing I will also say is that it's not just housing, and this may sound kind of elementary, it's community. It's people, place, and purpose. That's what everybody needs, and that's what everybody deserves in order to have a chance to flourish in their lives.
You can go.
No, I was just going to
compliment.
agree with pretty much all those comments. I do think, though, this declaration of emergency is great. And I do finally feel like there's a sense of urgency that's put in place to address homelessness, houselessness. But the one thing I always worry about is in the rush to do that, when the temporary facilities are built, people tend to think their job is done. And so it should not be a trade-off, but it often is, right? We build the barracks, and then we think we're done, but the barracks are short-term solutions. And so both options have to happen at the same time, right? We're building the housing while you're doing that, but public perception and public realities, people forget. And if it's out of sight, it is out of mind. So one of the things I'm always concerned about is the fact that this should not be a zero-sum game. Like, if you do one, you can't do the other. So it goes to the whole issue of mental health, right? Because the mental health system needs to be revamped as well. So why can't we do both at the same time? Not conflate them together, but do them both at the same time. And I think you would agree with that.
Yeah, I would. I
go
mean,
for it.
actually, I did. I was saying that in parallel.
Then Pete.
And it isn't a zero-sum game. It's a double down. There has to be we have to increase our investment and recognize that that we can't have people rotting in our streets. It's really that simple. And while we're building up and recovering from decades of neglect, we can do something about the conditions that people experience every day.
Yeah, I would think that houseless people would agree with you. I would think that other Angelinos would agree that we should not have people 5 a day, and actually the number is going up, dying on our streets. But I would also say that, and this isn't just Los Angeles, this is across the country as I think about it, the thing that we oftentimes offer up as temporary becomes the permanent, right? So that temporary thing that feels good at the moment that we pour tons of money into doesn't lead us out of the crisis, right? And so I don't think you're going to find anyone who says, yo, if we had great transitional housing or shelters that led to permanent housing, right, and that accepted you as a whole person, accepted your family, accepted, like, if you had these things and there was that permanent housing at the end of the tunnel, people would go in tomorrow. I mean, shelters are full now. Affordable housing is full now, today. So it's really about, for me, it's a decision that the electorate needs to make that sort of disrupts this insistence on, yes, the permanent, and policing and other things being the solution. Like, okay, if people don't move, let's just move them somewhere else, right? Oftentimes, the shelters that we have now, like bridge housing, it's nothing but a nexus to criminalization, right? It's like, well, we have 60 shelter beds over here, but there's 400 people in the encampment. As soon as those are full, we're gonna make sure we sweep the entire area. That's sweeping the entire area. Ain't no care with that, right? That's literally moving what they call problems somewhere else. And so I don't think it's a zero sum, but I also think when we have the conversation, we have to connect the two things. And I feel like we're always going to have to land back on housing and housing as a human right. I think the last thing with that is I feel like Angelinos care, right? Angelinos care about this crisis. I just think that conversations like this are necessary because I still think when we think about public opinion and the gaps, I think there are things that folks on this panel know that if more folks knew, if we can amplify the conversation, it could change some of the outcomes, right? And I feel like that's why I come out and speak on these panels, hopefully to be a megaphone for folks.
Hopefully, yes. Well, I want to dwell on one piece of that just a little bit longer. This idea, Jon, that you originally brought up about how the status quo is, is letting people die on the streets, that this is an emergency. I mean, I've heard the same thing from lots of LA politicians. They've built whole campaigns on it. This is an emergency. This is unacceptable. As Pete said, most unhoused people agree. They, by and large, don't want to be there either. And I've also seen in my reporting a lot of the temporary solutions become permanent or indefinite, whether it's tiny homes or bridge home. People will languish there for months, years, they'll sometimes get sick of it, leave. So what's the problem? If everybody agrees we need to do it all, this is an emergency. What we have right now is a humanitarian disaster. Everybody says that, but what is the problem? And I'm going to put it back to you because although you are not a politician, you are the one person on the panel who has worked in local government, or with at the county level, DMH. So, yeah, what's the problem? Is it money? What is it?
Oh boy. Well, it's a lot of things. It's not a either or. It has to be a number of different things. But I will start with bureaucracy. I have fought bureaucracy from the inside and the outside my whole career because it's devastating. It's devastating to the people that work in it, including the amazing people at the Department of Mental Health who have been there for a long time trying to take care of other human beings, but they end up taking care of medical charts and auditors. Sorry to the auditors. I say this all the time, and they're not happy with me. But there's so much process that we actually exhaust a lot of resources, checking boxes and not checking in on people. So that's one massive thing. And when I met with Mayor Bass several times before she was elected, I was telling her it's not just about more money. It's not just about pushing people harder. It's about getting rid of a lot of the red tape that just exhausts people and really limits the amount of impact that we can have. So you make a system that's more efficient, that's more nimble, and those are kind of oxymoronic with government agencies. And I'm not just talking about LA County. And I'm not suggesting that the people in LA County who are leaders don't care. I mean, supervisors care deeply, and they're trying. And obviously so is our mayor. Once you have a more efficient system, you have to also go after multiple aspects of the problem. It used to be, right to shelter. No, right to housing. I say it's right to community, and I was talking about that briefly before. We have to really think about what that means. Because if you take someone who is in a housing situation that doesn't suit them because they don't have people that they're connected to and they don't have a purpose in their life, it's not going to solve the bigger problems of giving them the opportunities that they require. When I talk about the emergency and getting people off the street so they don't languish, I'm not saying do that instead of generating housing and building community. We have to make the systems work more effectively. We have to put more funding into the system long term. And we have to go after turning off the spigot. So why are we not preventing people from falling into housing? I tried to argue, and I think this could happen if someone maybe even at the state level said it. For me, homelessness or the risk of becoming homelessness is a vital sign. You go to the doctor, and we have massive systems. We see lots of people in the county and through our amazing contractors. Yeah, you get your blood pressure, you get your pulse, you get your respiratory rate, you get your temperature. Where is that piece about your housing status in a situation like we have here? And if like your blood pressure, is off, we have to know about it and do something. And that would be a way, I think, to identify a lot of the people who are really at risk of falling into homelessness. So you go after the prevention, you get people who are homeless off the street into conditions where they are safer, and where actually the people who are trying to do the work can engage them. It's not easy to engage somebody in the street. I have people come over from Italy who really have built world-class community-based mental health treatment. They went to Skid Row. And when they went to Skid Row, they came back to talk to me, and they were crying. They're like, how can you do this? You can't take care of somebody. You can't engage somebody when they're in the street. So that's why I'm so insistent on that piece of it. And we have to create housing that's not so insanely expensive and takes so long to build. The first check I signed when I came to the Department of Mental Health that I remember was for like $240 million. How many
check?
units?
That's one check.
That's a big check.
You signed that check? Do you still have signing powers? Because
No,
you don't. Okay.
I don't.
That's all the zeros.
I'm
fit
having
on
trouble
the
paying
check.
my own
240, I got
mortgage.
something for you.
I can't even believe all the zeros fit on the check. But anyway.
No, but the point would be, how much housing is that? How much housing is that? It's like 500 units. Like, are you literally kidding me? And I was really upset about it. And I brought it up. I'm like, how are we doing this? And then we're not going to see it for like 3 to 5 years. Now, I know I'm not a developer. And I don't.
I can answer those questions.
Yeah, Dora, I want you to get in here because...
I'll stop. So I told you not to get me started.
Well, that is why you're on the panel.
Okay, I will hear. I
Started,
just
but-
want to say that is unacceptable. That it's going to take that long and that it's going to cost that much money. That's my perspective. I'm not a developer.
Well, I'm going with this, and I
There's
do
so
want...
much in there that I want to go with.
me
though.
too.
But go ahead.
Yeah, please. So I want you
I'm just
all to
gonna
go with
hang
it.
out.
But Dora, I want to bring you in because you are a housing developer, and this relates to something Pete was talking about before about this disintegration of the safety net and us not doing public housing in this country anymore. And I don't think a lot of people have a good understanding actually of how most affordable housing gets built nowadays in Los Angeles and other places. And I think people do wonder why is it so expensive, and I don't think they realize that it is private developers doing the fundraising, doing the building, and that adds cost, adds time. So could you just talk to that piece of it?
How much time do we have?
Yeah, just a little. But then I do have some things to sort of rein us back in, but I want to go with the...
I want to follow up on a few things that Jon made too that I thought was really important to stress. So on the housing development side, he's right. For many years, the federal government was involved in building and operating what's known as public housing throughout the country. And in the 80s was when they pretty much stopped doing that. And they made funding available to private developers, both nonprofits and for-profits, to build it for the federal government. And when they did that, actually, it wasn't even for the federal government, it was for the communities. Because the federal government was building it in the communities, they decided to allocate resources to developers in those communities to work with local governments to have the housing built. So one of the things that happened was instead of the government funding 100% of the construction, they only allocate a portion of the funds. So they required people who borrowed money from the federal government to raise the rest elsewhere. So the federal government was only paying for 10, 20, 30%. So organizations like ours have to cobble the resources together. State, county, city. No one funding source wanted to be first in, and they didn't want to fund 100% of it. In order to make it fair and competitive, competitive and fair, like Jon's point about the bureaucracy, every agency at every level of government decided to create their own process. So the county has an application process, but it's only once a year. The city of Los Angeles has it twice a year. The state has it twice a year, but they have 5 different programs, and some of the programs are once a year, and some of them are twice a year. So we have to, doesn't matter whether you're a for-profit or a nonprofit, you have to figure out what the criteria is to apply, because this funding is only for veterans. This funding is only for people who make less than $20,000 a year. This funding is only for farm workers. So we have to figure that out and time it. So, if I go into the city in March, then I can go to the county in October. And if I don't get the county, I have to try the state, and the state's only in June, but I've missed the cycle because it's October. So that adds several years immediately. One of the innovations that we're trying to push in the city, state, and county, trying to get them all to work together, is to have just one application, because they all have separate applications. And in the beginning, they wanted hard copies, and they wanted 10 copies of the same thing. So our binders are like this thick. But anyway, so now we're trying to push for a single application which they're moving towards, city and county are working towards. The state has actually consolidated their application process as well. So that's just the application, the funding. And so to John's point, like DMH might have provided me $2 million, but I have to get all the other funding. That by the time I'm ready to access the $2 million, because I finally got the rest, it's been 3 years, right? Now, all along, I'm designing the building, and I'm going through the permitting approval process, the building safety, plan check, make sure it's done right, and there are delays there sometimes too, which I won't go into. And then we want to tell the community what we're doing. So we present our plans, and communities are not always welcoming. When they hear homelessness and they hear, for us, mental illness, it requires a lot of community meetings. Sometimes I'm fully funded and I'm still doing meetings, and I've got to get started. And so all those reasons are what causes the construction process to take so long. The construction itself is only 18 months, but all that thing that precedes it is what takes so long. And in permanent supportive housing, which is the work that I do for people who've experienced homelessness and have a mental health diagnosis, not only do I need the construction funding, I need what's called the rental subsidies, like the Section 8, to keep the rents low. People who come to my buildings don't have the ability to pay market rent, but I still need to be able to operate the building. I need to pay the gardener, I need to pay the utilities, I need to, paint the building. So I need to have income, which comes a percentage from the housing authorities. They pay 70%, and so that way our tenants only pay 30% and have that stability in paying the rent. But the third piece of funding I need is services, because there's no way you can provide permanent supportive housing to people with all these disabling conditions and not have the services in the building to make sure that they can stay stable in housing. And this is where the resources come into play, because not only are we talking about getting resources from all levels of government to build, services funding is the hardest funding to come from, to get access to. And even when you do get it, it's not great. So to one point, in 1994, I received a contract for $54,000 to provide services to the tenants in the building. In 2023, I'm still getting $54,000. There is no increase to the contract amount. And the same thing with Measure H that we passed, which is wonderful. The contract rates were set in 2018 and has not been raised. So it becomes really, really hard. And so when we talk about the emergency and everyone treating it such, we have to look in the entire system of building, construction, and also the services side. And that's why DMH is a strong partner, because they sometimes come in and supplement what we don't have the resources to do. And this is why nonprofits like us, even though we're a real estate developer to a large extent, we still have to fundraise to fill those gaps in services.
Boy,
Go.
Yeah, I'm gonna go. And I'm just sitting here thinking, because I'm gonna pass it back to you. But just a lot there, and so I'm with you, John, in terms of how much it costs to build permanent supportive housing, right? When I started this work, it was like $110,000 per unit to build housing. Now we're up to $800,000 per unit to build some units, right? And it's interesting with the Triple H dollars. There was a provision, because we did electoral engagement on H and Triple H and all of these policies for resources to build houseless housing, and there was an
Triple
audit.
H is the bond measure from
Bond
2016
measure,
that probably people know,
$1.2 billion,
but passed to build affordable housing.
It was supposed to be
housing.
10,000. I'm going to pass it back to Dora in a second. Mayor Garcetti was like, it's 10,000 units, and then a year in, they were like, well, it's not really 10,000.
Yeah, they
It's
were
less
always
than that.
counting the 3,000 that they were going
This
to
is-
build
this
anyway
is
during the
correct.
time length of the bond measure. So it was really
It was
7,000.
unfortunate
but
messaging.
But it does add up to 10,000
100%.
if you add what they
And
were going to do.
It created expectations from voters, right? For those, we see people, we want them 10,000 units. We don't want to hear about the remix. Nonetheless, it wasn't about the remix. It was really about, and so as part of Triple H, there was a required audit that was supposed to be performed after each annual disbursement of resources. Oh man, they kicked and screamed. And at that time, you had the unveiling of massive corruption in City Hall. And so no one wanted to release like what's happening with the dollars. And so we're organizers. And so we were like, And we fought to pass this thing. So we were like, we're going to track down the controller. He's going to do this audit. It took us 2 years to track him down to do the audit. And then once we tracked him down, he does the audit and he shows sort of per dollar where all these resources go. And, you know, we in Los Angeles, and if you read the LA Times or something, you'll hear that the land costs. Like when you're going to develop a unit, it's all about the land. It's the land. It costs a lot to build. Well, then Galpin releases a study and shows that, well, actually, only 10% of the cost goes to land, 50% of the cost goes to construction, and another 40% goes to soft costs, right? And of course, soft costs were like professional fees and permitting, and it's literally the place that continues to replenish bureaucracy, right? Some of it, right? And so we just have to figure out, we've got to shake up that model. Like I'm developing something called eco-hoods. We won't talk about that all tonight, maybe before we go. But for me, we oftentimes talk about these systems. I heard you, John. It's like it's about efficiency, right? But I come from an orientation, and we just need to fix the system, you know. And I come from this orientation where people are always talking about broken systems. But a broken system is one whose outcomes can't be measured. All of these systems around us, we're measuring all of the outcomes. Like we know how many kids, you know, from third grade testing scores, you're going to go to the prison, school to prison pipeline. We know how many people, if they lose a job, are going to be houseless. So we know we have the metrics, but we don't have the political will to do anything different, right? So for me, when we think about this crisis, first we have to look at the budget and figure out what is recession proof? Like, what is that line item in the city and the county that when everything else is getting cut, when services are being cut, when we're losing teachers, when health services are being decimated, what's getting money? So we need to look at that. And that's always policing, right? Policing is always getting money. We also have to look at what are public assets that we own that we should be converting into housing. So what, like all the government land, all the government buildings, all the homes that the government actually own right now should be used to help solve this crisis, right? We need leadership that's bold. We need a Marshall Plan, right? And we need to understand it's not one size fits all. Dora needs to do what Dora does, right? But so many other folks in the bureaucracy and outside also need to open the checkbooks, open the inventory, and we need to get to work. Will we solve the crisis tomorrow? No. But will we begin to make a noticeable dent? I would say yes, right?
Well, speaking of bureaucracy, we kind of dispensed with the sort of the premise of the mental health crisis, driving the homelessness crisis immediately when we started the discussion, and I think that's fine. But I do want to ask a question about that specifically, which is just in the last year or so, or a couple of years, state lawmakers approved this policy that's taking shape now for something called care courts, which maybe people here have heard about, and it's the basic premise is it's supposed to be something that is in between doing nothing for a person who can't take care of themselves, who has a serious mental health issue going on, or a debilitating substance abuse issue.
I like this section right here. You asked the question and all I heard was like,
yeah, I saw
no.
the thumbs down. And, something between that and a full-on conservatorship, which is difficult to do, which, raises all sorts of other questions. Anyway, that's the idea. And I think that Newsom has pitched this in a lot of ways as a solution to the homelessness crisis in places like Los Angeles, in places like San Francisco. And I wonder what you guys think about, this program. I think people are going to have expectations around it, and they're going to start piloting it in Los Angeles County this fall, I believe. So what can we realistically expect, do you think, from a program? What do you think of that proposal, and what can we actually expect from it as it relates to homelessness? Because it has certainly been pitched to voters as a solution to homelessness, I think.
And I think that's a mistake. It is not a homelessness issue. It has to do with a mental health issue. And to pitching it, kind of like the whole HHH and what happened there with the expectations, this is not going to end homelessness. It's not. And so I just think it's a mistake to have pitched it that way. It is dealing with people with a mental health crisis. It is not a solution to ending homelessness, because where are the resources to build the housing that we still need? Where are the services funding that we still need? So I'm not saying that it's not a good idea to implement Care Court, but to pitch it in that way is a mistake. Inaccurate also.
Yeah, I would agree. This I just there's something that Pete said that I just want to dovetail on before I lose it. And
By all means.
it has to do, it has to do with inventory, and it's something that since COVID hit and everybody kind of fled the office, and this is just a genuine question. Like the commercial real estate market is collapsing. We've got millions of square feet of habitable space across the country. Why are we not using it for housing? I mean, and go for it.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about cost. So
Done.
It is not as easy to convert an office building into housing as people think, from someone who actually develops housing. And so the cost issue, right? So I mean, we'll talk. I forgot to talk about the cost issue. So fixated on how long it takes to build housing. So on the cost issue, a portion of it has to do with public policy priorities, and it also applies to the commercial spaces, because we are not efficient in what we do. We try to be efficient, and we're not allowed to be. So for instance, we want an environmentally sustainable building, right? But do we really need to implement a gray water system? Do we really need to have solar? Do we need to be rated platinum LEED, if you guys are into environmental sustainability measurements? Or can it be the third level down as opposed to the highest level? Does it have to have certain features of a building that may not be necessary? In the city of Irvine, for instance, you need to build a swimming pool for all affordable housing developments. Is that really necessary, right? So these requirements that the public sector put in cause some of the costs to go up. So I wanted to address that. But the commercial, the wiring is different. What you use for commercial versus residential is different. So it, in some cases, costs just as much to renovate an existing office building as it is to build ground up new construction.
What about the care courts, you guys?
I know. Maybe we can talk about this later, because I'm like, how do we define?
I'm not saying it can't be done. I just think we have to strip away all the requirements to make it more efficient.
Yes, and why can't we do that?
No, I completely agree.
I mean, who's going to define housing? I mean, it's like a place to.
Yeah. I'm busy building supportive housing. I can't change that system.
Okay. Well, if we need to, because there's going to be a lot of dormant inventory all over the country for a long time. The whole model of business has changed, and we're just going to let it sit or knock it down. Anyway, I apologize. And don't get me started also on the boarding care issue, which is another one. And leveraging existing infrastructure for housing, which is what you brought up, and that's why I kind of went off on this little tangent.
So it's my fault.
Yes. Blame Pete. Blame Pete. The Care Court thing, the marketing around Care Court has been horrendous and irresponsible, and very unfortunate. In my opinion, and this is a controversial topic, some of the work that we did in LA County, in particular the development of, or the redevelopment of a program called the HOME program, the Homeless Outreach and Mobile Engagement Team, has a lot to do with, I think, the development of Care Courts. And what we piloted with the HOME program was basically having our outreach teams identify individuals who were not living safely in the community. So there's this term called gravely disabled, which is ultimately what leads to someone getting into a conservatorship if they've got a certain, illness and they're unwilling over time to accept care. So individuals like that, and that would be within that 10% I was talking about earlier. Let's just say someone with a chronic psychotic disorder who has not gotten treatment. but to go and have outreach with guaranteed resources up front and to be relentless about engagement in a voluntary way. And when I say resources, I'm talking about guaranteed housing, guaranteed treatment, real 24/7, not what we actually provide here, which is not easy, and access to open residential treatment. So if you go to somebody who's homeless, who's unwilling to accept care for a variety of reasons, some which are very, very valid, and you're offering them resources in a relentless way, and I'm not talking about like over the course of a week, I'm talking about months, and I've done it, and you still can't get to the point where someone's willing to engage, then it's a question of, well, okay, what do we do? Because you're not living safely in the community. That's a term that hasn't been well defined, but it's starting to be pushed about in the state, in the legislature. And it doesn't mean imminently homicidal or suicidal. It means you're not caring for yourself. You're at risk of dying, or there are things that are creating public health challenges. In that scenario, what can we do besides saying, oh, okay, we're going to give you the full conservatorship, a surrogate decision maker, and take away your civil liberties? Is there a way for us to create a continuum to engage you so that you can get care and actually not need a conservatorship? There's things, and there are tools like that exist. There's shared decision making. There's a psychiatric advance directive. There's Laura's Law, AOT, which I think is in principle a good thing, although the bureaucracy around it and the exclusionary nature of it, I have a problem with. There's temporary conservatorships. So how can we, when someone's in that situation where they're not living safely in the community, and you make every effort to bring them real-time resources, and by that I mean, will you accept a place to go right now and come off the street? Yes. Not get in line for 9 months, but like right now, And one of the things that I was trying to do before I left, and I think that the department and the county is trying to do, is to actually get to take Project Room Key to the next level and actually own hotels or lease them and use them for this kind of purpose, so someone can in real time get taken to a place off the street. We bring in a guaranteed 24/7 treatment team. That's what Care Court, I think, is trying to do. It's trying to say, let's find a place in the middle to engage someone with removing as little of their civil liberties as possible. But you can't do that in a responsible way if you're not leaning in with resources first, guaranteed resources first. Paternalistic approaches that don't do that are inappropriate, they're inhumane, and they should never be endorsed.
Yeah, I guess I'll pick up right there. I feel like a lot of what we hear about Care Court is careless. There's not a lot of care in it, particularly when we think about these. I'm drawing a blank. It's when you go through the court. You have these cases. You have like this case file, and you have to agree to certain things, right? You have to agree to housing. You have to agree to medication. But the Care Court doesn't provide any of those things. So if you're houseless and you go and you get this care plan that says you must meet all of these things, but we're not going to give you any of them, you're headed right toward the conservatorship situation, right? And when we think about poor people and conservators, when we look at the wealthy and we see lots of wealthy folks didn't do real well with their conservators, the thing that really that frightens me is when the state becomes your conservator, right? When the state, and when we look at Care Court, what's going to be built? So a lot of power in the courts, a lot more money in the court system, and at the end of the day, when that housing doesn't exist, that's part of your case plan, they're going to build something for you. And if, history is bad around when the government comes in and legislates where you need to be. And so I think there's still too many, like the talking point sounds good when Newsom is out there, like, We just care. But when you interrogate the details, you're like, oh no, it doesn't feel like you really care. This feels tricky. And so again, it's important not to be driven by the talking point. It's important for us to interrogate a little bit more, because at the end of the day, what we could have is another court system that's costly and expensive. And the thing that we agreed to is like, because we all care about people, people won't get that care. And so we can't just fall for everything, hook, line, and sinker every time without really exploring.
More bureaucracy.
Oh, 100%.
Well, I have a whole pile of
Yeah, I saw that.
questions for you guys, but I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. So I don't know. I think we'll just go to that now. And then if people don't have a lot of questions, I can always go back to my pile, but want to make sure we do that before things get too late. So I think there is somebody with a mic who's going to call on people. So I'm not the caller honor. So I see hands and I want to call on people, but I don't think I'm supposed to. Right. I think it's out of my control, right?
He's got a mic right now.
Yeah, so the guy with the mic, yeah, they're going to pass them around.
Hi, I think I've got a mic. You opened and talked about problems with substance abuse, and we never got to that. I think CareCorps probably is part of that whole thing, not only mental health, but is there a barrier where people who are put in these housing have restrictions on their substance use? And is that why some of the people are very reluctant or won't go into some of the housing units?
Yeah, I think and Pete might know this better, but for a lot of the interim facilities, whether it's tiny homes or hotels or shelters, there are restrictions, and so that could be one of the reasons. In a permanent supportive housing, it is someone's apartment. They sign a lease, just like what you do behind closed doors. If you don't disturb anybody, then there's no issues, and it's not a prohibition. However, when someone does move into supportive housing, there's an effort to deploy an approach that we call harm reduction, to try to work with folks to reduce the harm to themselves so that they can gain a little bit more control over their own lives. And so that's one reason I think in supportive housing it kind of works a little bit better than in interim facilities, because you have restrictions on it. So I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, I think this idea of homeless resistant or people resistant, and it's been in the headlines a lot, and I've been going after the mayor because of it. I've been doing this a long time, and I think in all my years I've met one person who was really paranoid about the government and other things that did not want to go inside, right? So I have not met that. I have not met these hordes of people who just want to chill outside in a tent and be cold and watch their neighbors.
Like Cece,
right?
like Cece,
Like
right?
Cece.
Cece.
I just don't know where these people don't exist, right, in my world. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to throw in and say, as someone that reports on the issue, spends a lot of time talking to people who are unhoused, going to encampments, I find the same thing, that by and large, I think there is an idea that there's abundant resources and a lot of shelter beds, and that there's widespread resistance to taking those resources, maybe because of substance abuse or other issues, but I don't find that to be the case. I find that people do want help by and large. It doesn't mean that substance abuse isn't an issue that people are dealing with. It doesn't mean that meth, for example, isn't a ubiquitous drug in Los Angeles, because it absolutely is. It's cheap and it's plentiful, and it alleviates a lot of the discomfort of being unhoused, if you're cold, if you're hungry. So I think a lot of people turn to it sometimes because they're in the situation of being homeless. So, there's a lot of complicated overlap there between substance abuse and what's going on with, meth, fentanyl, the drugs that happen to be cheap and plentiful right now, and how that's intersecting with the homelessness crisis. But I don't personally find in my work that, that it's as simple as there's a huge substance abuse crisis that's driving homelessness and then driving people to resist resources. I think it's more that the resources are spotty a lot of the time, and maybe just because somebody doesn't take an immediate offer, sort of, some kind of vague offer of help, doesn't mean that they're not open to help or would prefer to be inside.
And then, I mean, just building on that, this other idea, one, that there's this plethora of resources that are sitting empty. I mean, I just look at you, Dora. Do you have empty units in your development? Like, what's your vacancy rate? Like, folks are showing up. Like, when new buildings in Skid Row are built, folks are lined up around the block trying to give an application to get in the building, right? Folks have these Section 8, these emergency Section 8 vouchers that are scouring around the entire county trying feverishly to find someone who will accept. Like, people are looking for housing, but it's one of those things where it's just not enough, right? And we have to figure that out.
We do. Okay, let's take more questions.
Man, your hand is just up there. They're just walking right by you. I think you might have to jump up or.
Hi. I'm going to be very honest. I am a homeless person. I don't like to say that because people get scared away. I'm atypical in that I don't do alcohol or legal drugs. I do have a chronic illness, 47 years. I've been in 2 transitional housings. I'm in one now. I'm now homeless 12 years in the HMIS CES system. I gave up after 8 years. I lived in my car those 8 years. I no longer have a car. But I want to tell you, my experience in 2 transitional housing facilities is that I learned, as somebody that doesn't do alcohol or drugs, that it's low barrier, that's mandated, I thought, by the feds who fund LASA for the county and the city. In fact, it's a LA County request. What I've seen and experienced is that it's a safe place for people to sleep, and there's a lot of drug use. There's rules in the first place I was in that you can't bring drugs inside or alcohol, that you can't go in another person's tiny house, no going into them. The staff largely did not regulate that, so there's a lot of drug use. I take insulin, so I used to use a syringe. I would find used syringes uncapped outside my tiny house. We had one person die of fentanyl in her tiny house who would come into our facility trying to quit it, and she was not able to stay off it. We've had several others need to be resuscitated just outside our facility. I asked a community member in the neighborhood what the neighborhood thought about the homeless facility. He said they were told about it for 2 or 3 years. They largely opposed it because they felt it would be crime and drug dealing, and that's exactly what it brought. Outside of where I was staying, somebody was stabbed in the neck. Other people were stabbed. I did not feel safe, even coming back there at 8 o'clock at night. And I feel for all those people. I do have a relative, several that have mental illness, like major, like schizophrenia. So I'm aware nobody asked to be mentally ill. But to me, there's a lot of, so yes, there is drug use and alcohol use going on inside the facilities, although it's not officially not permitted. I read of the juvenile halls in LA County that were being shut down because security was not keeping the drugs from coming in. I would say it's the same situation in the transitional housing. But I would also like, forgive me, but the truth needs to be told sometimes. But that doesn't mean those people are not in need. And I want to point out something that a doctor in San Gabriel Valley working with homeless told me. He said, "You, ma'am, are depressed. That, according to DSM, is considered mentally ill. So when we, the community, say, I don't want them, the mentally ill, in my neighborhood, our one finger's pointing at them, but we got three fingers pointing back at ourselves. So and not all mentally ill are crazy. But I agree with all of you that there is a problem. I know one a friend of mine where I'm currently living is out on the street because he's acting out. I don't know if he takes meds or not, but I know he did have a diagnosis at some point. He's a brilliant man, but when he's acting crazy.
Well, thank you.
Could I just
Yeah.
point out one thing? I'm wondering if you have any answers to this. As somebody who has experienced the services for homeless, I see some situations, there's an incredible amount of turnover of staff. There's a lot of untrained or insufficiently trained staff. Some staff don't care and can make your situation as a homeless person worse because they become very nasty at times. I understand we're a very trying community, many, and the wrong kind of accountability. I lost my permanent supportive housing I signed the papers for late last fall in January because I was moved to another facility. One case manager did not connect with the other case manager, both under the same company. And there was a change of staff at the permanent supportive housing building. And so they dropped me. I've been waiting 12 years to get housed. I think there's insufficient accountability in areas where it matters.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to talk so much.
No, thank you for sharing your experience. And yeah, we'll take that question about the staff turnover and the dropping of the ball. That doesn't sound very unusual.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned the contract that I have that was $54,000 in '94 and is still the same, right? So the funding of the services for staff is problematic. There was a study that was actually mentioned in the LA Times recently. I think trying to remember, I think it was Rand Corporation did a study about the homeless services sector, and the people doing work in the sector didn't mention about training, but it did talk about how the pay was so low that many of the people in the field were also experiencing housing insecurity. And so when people doing the work and trying to serve and help other people are themselves experiencing trauma as it relates to housing instability, it becomes really hard to really provide the services that people really need. So on the turnover side, I don't disagree. I think, especially during COVID, it hit, for some agencies, 30-40% turnover. I think it's stabling now, and I think people are starting to pay attention to what workers need. But that doesn't excuse the fact that it did happen over a period of time, and hopefully things are going to progress better. We have been, like most agencies, trying to implement programs and opportunities for staff to stay. And so for us as an agency, this year I was so happy that we're like less than 15% turnover. So I'm so excited. But it was a while where we were like with everybody else because of the pay, right? But hiring the right people to provide the services, I think people really in this field are committed. They're not in it for the money, for sure. But certainly opportunities for additional training to make sure that the compassion is there. If someone themselves are having some issues as a provider, that they should step back momentarily so that somebody else can step in and help those who are in need, who are actually on the streets in front of them.
I want to make sure we get more questions in because I did see a lot of hands up. So I know there's probably more answers here, but. Okay. Yes.
Hey, John.
I recognize that voice.
I recognize that face. So I used to work for the Department of Mental Health with Dr. Sherin. But so I have I wish I had one question, but I'll see how I can do with this. One thing I haven't heard from any of the panelists is about disparities for unserved and communities of color in particular. And that's problematic for Care Court because we looked at the data, and the data that's available, because the other issue is that the counties have not been collecting data for people who are under conservatorship. Less than 50% of the counties had been reporting, and for those that had been reporting, you see high numbers of Black folk who are receiving services under mandated orders, much higher than the representative population for California. So that tells us immediately that there's a problem. And I'll tell you right now, it's not a problem with Black people. Just saying, So it's a problem with the services and that are culturally aligned or linguistically relevant for the communities being served. And that has been, I think, a bit of an oversight when we talk about many of the supports and services for people who are unhoused and or for people who experience mental health conditions. It's kind of like, oh, it's a one-size-fits-all. It is not a one-size-fits-all. We don't have, so again, I'm not a fan of Care Court, and I have to be very open about the fact that I am on the CARE Act work group, poking holes at it and loving it every minute of the way. And not to say that it should work or it shouldn't work, but more importantly to say, well, wait a minute, you're going to give a person 395 pages worth of documentation as the respondent, the person who's supposed to go in Care Court, but you're saying they're super duper ill. How are they going to understand all this documentation that you just gave them that's written at a college level? Help me understand that. So it's not saying it's right or it's wrong. It's saying if you're going to do it, freaking make it how humans work, maybe, possibly. So I do have a question about the disparities issue and the fact that we continue to pass legislation in California that disproportionately impacts Black Californians, and we have a Black California Reparations Act that doesn't technically say, it actually says that legislation shouldn't be passed if it continues to perpetuate disparities for the Black community. But every time we're seeing legislation passed that disproportionately affects Black community. I'm also very passionate about this because I am a person who lives with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Doing well, been doing well for years, it's great, but who knows what tomorrow brings, and tomorrow I could end up as somebody decides, oh, well, she's acting a little funny, let me see if I can refer her to Care Court, because it's about that simple. So I don't know if you can speak a little bit to some of the disparity issues as it pertains to the intersection of housing and mental illness, and what we're missing. We don't have friendship benches in California. We don't have recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. We only have 9 peer respites. We know there are so many services that we don't even have, yet we'll move to things like Care Court versus we don't have safe Black spaces in LA. So what are we going to do about some of those things as well? Thank you.
You want to go first?
No, go ahead. No, please.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think just not taking too much time, but I think a couple times. So I was on the and the irony here is just too thick. I was on the Black People Experiencing Homelessness Policy Work Group at LASA, right? And that irony is just too thick, right? But I got to sit around the table for a number of months with Black providers and Black impacted people who experienced the disparities real time, right? Experienced tools, right, that weren't culturally sensitive, vulnerability indexes that ensured that Black people wasn't getting in, right? I got to listen to mayors and council people scratch their head like, well, I thought I was investing in a system that could potentially lift Black people up, but it's actually spitting them out, right? And I'm with you. Like, this is my editorial comment just to say, I think you already named all the things. And what it's going to take is just Black folks and our allies keeping our foot on the gas about these disparities. Because if there's going to be a system that goes awry in any community, it's going to go awry in the Black community first, 100%, right? Then the brown community is going to be right behind that. And then every other community, right? As we show up and arrive. And so 100%.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any particularly super wise things to say. And I mean, honestly, Karis, one of the reasons why I wanted you to come into the department is to help go after these challenges. At the end of the day, I think we have to look, and as far as care court, I'm not up here saying care court is some good thing. I think there are principles that need to be fleshed out, and they haven't been, and it is going to have, I think, when it's implemented, some negative consequences, and they will likely, as we're saying, impact certain people more than others, which is a bit of an American tradition. But the key is to put more and more resources across the board. And by that, I mean, yes, housing, I mean, yes, treatment, but I mean opportunities into communities preferentially. And we haven't done that. I mean, I made major efforts when I was in the department to invest in the South Side. We put more resources into, I would say, those service areas than anywhere else for this reason. And that doesn't mean that, putting resources into the South Side is going to help across the county, but it's trying to go after big ticket items. We have a massive integrated behavioral health center with the old MLK hospital that was going to be torn down and just was sitting dormant. That's a massive resource that hopefully will help people get services. We've invested in a lot of housing in the area. We created the first child and family well-being center that brings multiple departments together to help kids and families that are system involved get care. So I think it's about investing in a targeted way to those communities that need and deserve resources that they've been deprived of for a long time. And as I think during COVID, we did a study. We created heat maps around LA County to look for those areas that were the most impacted, and that's where we tried to target as much resource as we could, during that time. So, these are structural problems, and we as a society have to, as you're saying, keep our foot on the pedal and be relentless, and we have to hold our elected officials accountable. We elect them.
Well, I know it's getting late, so I want to make sure we get in a couple more questions. And there's some very enthusiastic hands over here.
Just stand there.
Okay, yeah. Whoever has a mic. I don't know.
Thank you so much for my team here. We just met. My name's Camille. I have a very unique relationship with housing. I was born into military housing while my father served in Vietnam. After my parents divorced, I lived in San Bernardino public housing. I was a property manager up until August 2022 when I was relieved of my duties there. I currently live in affordable housing in the city of Burbank. I have experienced, while a property manager for approximately the past 10 years, homelessness twice. The only reason I wasn't unhoused homeless was that my mother, 85-year-old mother, lives here, and so she let me camp out. My daughter and I camp out with her. In my public housing situation in the city of Burbank, I just recently received a $400 rent increase notice. When I talked to the county told me the reason that is that the affordable housing doesn't have the same restrictions. So if it was market rate or, of course, rent controlled, it would be a little bit different. I want to offer this as a person who worked in the industry by way of hope. Section 8, if you guys check your laws, Section 8 is accepted everywhere. Property managers don't want you to know that, but I'm letting everybody here know. It's the law. So Section 8 isn't the otherism that it always was. Section 8, every property company in California that operates in California has to accept that. Talk to me if you want more information on that. The housing thing, this is the last thing I'll say, because like I said, I'm passionate about it. I think housing agencies need to run like hospitals, 24 hours a day, an acute unit, a chronic unit, inpatient, outpatient. I think it needs to be looked at. It's all in how it's looked. From the county perspective, I asked a medical doctor this before. Why isn't there an analytics department in the county? Just like we have for the Dodgers and the Lakers, analytics.
Well,
I'm out.
okay. Anyone want to take that question? Why isn't there? Yeah. More of a, commentary addition to the panel, but I like it. We're getting, a lot of lived experience and insights from our audience too, which I really actually appreciate. Let's take one or two more questions, depending on how long it takes to do the first question, and then and we'll get to two if we can, and then we'll wrap it up.
My question is for Mr. White. I've noticed throughout the conversation you were very intentional about using the word houseless. So I remember, going years back, it was homeless, then it was people experiencing homelessness, and then it was unhoused. So you seem to be very intentional about using the word houseless. Is there a reason why?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there's definitely a reason why. A couple of things, and I think, Doc, you began to touch on this earlier. We have to expand our idea of housing beyond brick and mortar, four walls, and a roof over your head. When we think about houselessness in Los Angeles, 80% of those who are houseless in Los Angeles come from Los Angeles. And many years ago, they attempted to sell us on this idea that folks were just coming in from New York and other places. This isn't our problem. We finally realized that we finally admitted, they already knew, that we are manufacturers of houselessness. The fact that 80% of those in Los Angeles are from Los Angeles, and many folks are now, with gentrification and other things, many folks are now houseless in communities in which they've lived for decades, right? And it's those communities that actually keep us safe. It's the safety nets that we have to create, right, in the midst of organized abandonment. It's the relationships. It's those types of things that create community that becomes home, right? And so that's why even when I think about people's thinking about Skid Row, people would be like, "Yo, never go to Skid Row. It's lawless and it's reckless abandon." And I quickly say, "Nah, that's the spot down the street called City Hall," right? Because in Skid Row, everyone knows one another, right? It's the place where folks are looking out for one another, right? And like in any other community, is there violence? Yeah, but there's violence in every community that we come across. And so for me, and for us, home had to expand beyond this idea of just bricks and mortar, right? Community and everything that keeps community together is how we started talking about houseless and not homeless, because community is a home.
I do think we have time.
I got that from the doc. He's like, yeah. All right.
I think we do have time for another question. I see. I know. I want to call on people.
There's like three, right?
But I hear the.
It's all good.
Go ahead.
Alrighty.
Can I? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and then people can also ask questions. We'll be outside, so if you want to ask a question to anybody here, we'll be.
All right.
We'll be here after the thing. But
I have
yes.
a question.
Yes.
Up here.
Who is it?
Right over here.
Okay.
Okay. I go to a lot of these events. Homelessness is a passion. I mean, I've had two brothers who were homeless, both because of mental illness. I've had somebody close to me, die in rehab, partly because of addiction and mental illness. I sit on the board of Volunteers of America, LA, and we're one of the largest, if not the largest, non-governmental provider of homeless services in LA County. And so I go to a lot of these, and I'm a lawyer, so I approach everything with a level of skepticism. and I go to a lot of these events, and everybody talks, and they talks, and they talk in generalities about what needs to be done. And I always sometimes have a visceral reaction to that, quite honestly. So I asked the panel, if you could name one thing that LA needs to be doing differently to actually move the needle, what would that be? Because I operate from the premise that what we've been doing thus far, although there have been some successes, a lot of what we do has failed as a matter of policy in dealing with homelessness. I mean, there's a reason why the problem's getting worse. Okay. So I'd ask this panel, one thing, concrete, that we could do differently in LA to try to move the needle and improve the situation in dealing with the unhoused.
Make
I like
housing
this.
a
This is a
human
good
right.
lightning round
There it
wrap
is.
up. So
Make housing a human right.
make
in
housing a
Los
human
Angeles.
right. Okay.
That's it.
Dora.
What does a human right mean? Define how that changes something.
How does it? Well,
Define it as a human right. How does that?
we got the whole thing. So here it is. So it's not just if we define making housing as a human right, it's actually the policies that follow that, right? And so when we think about housing as a human right, housing as a human right doesn't speak just about bricks and mortar, right? It talks about transportation. It talks about healthcare. It talks about opportunity. And I see you. You're like, whoa, that goes far. But some communities, like if we had transportation, if we had opportunity, right? The community would change immediately. If we had real investment in South Central Los Angeles, right? If we weren't reeling from the impacts of segregation and redlining and racial covenants, and if we had the resources and the equity that we could have, we wouldn't have this conversation. Right? And so when we begin to move toward housing as a human right and resources and reparations that begin to address, and I see you keep doing that, but these are the types of things that we need. It doesn't solve anything.
Well, we'll keep it moving, but I will say,
I beg to differ.
I
beg to differ.
I will throw in New York City. New York City has a right to shelter, right? Doesn't mean anything in theory, right? But it means a lot in practice because they have a $3 billion a year shelter system because they have this legal mandate, and so they have a shelter system that is problematic in a lot of ways, but they don't have a lot of street encampments, right? So that's an example of how a policy, something like that, a directive like that, can lead to policies that are concrete and have an effect.
Yeah.
In that case, it's a right to shelter, not a right to housing.
Way of looking at it is if you accept that housing is a human right, it's not an individual issue. It is a public policy priority. It becomes a budgetary priority. And so your resources go to, if in fact housing is a human right, your resources follow, and that addresses all the issues he just talked about. And we don't have that here. And so to answer your question, I would say, because I'm very focused on the specifics, is that crazy system about cobbling financing to build affordable housing, right? We gotta stop that. We have to find, I've even said, city, county, state, take turns. We are all applying. So this project, the state will fund a community of friends 100%. This other project, VOA 100%. So that I don't have to go there and find. So if I know the state's funding mine and the county's funding yours, then we can build that housing in a third of the time that it's taking us now. So that would be my one recommendation for change.
What's your one thing, John?
Well, I just want to get to this issue of policy just really quick on, and New York is a great example. There's a right to shelter in New York, and what that's translated into is that there's the same number of homeless people, but here 3/4 are unsheltered, and there 3/4 are sheltered. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it can be specific, and it can lead to, I think, significant.
That's actually a policy, not just a concept. It's actually a policy.
Well, I think
a
that's
policy
what we're
that
saying.
implements the concept.
Yeah.
Well, the human right to housing is a policy that we're discussing at the state level. That leads to all of the subsequent policies at the local level that one would have to factor in racial analysis, all these types of things. So, I mean, that's what I got for you.
Yeah, I think we should kind of head up and all chat for a bit.
Sounds good. I have one thing too.
No, I mean, one thing I would do is I think, we look at how we house a lot of people here. It's amazing how many people get housed and how many people are falling into homelessness. So I think I mentioned something earlier about creating a vital sign. That's actually something that could be done. You could, through every indigent and Medicaid person that engages the public system, ought to be screened, and we ought to have policies that direct solutions to prevent them from falling into homelessness, which it could be if you're within 3 months of not being able to pay, then you come on in and we're going to deal with it. And that number should shrink.
Can I say one thing? Just a few years ago, your medical provider, when you go through your physical, they now ask you about mental health, right? So add another question, how's your housing situation?
That is specific. I will say something that the federal government could do overnight that would make a huge difference in Los Angeles is to fully fund the Section 8 program. I mean, it would cost a lot of money, and you'd have to do a lot of budget wizardry and things, but that is something that could be done overnight that would help a lot. I think if you're Section 8 eligible in Los Angeles, your chances of actually getting a voucher are something like 1 in 8, the last I checked, which was worse than other places around the country where it's like 1 in 4. So if it was just everybody who's eligible gets one, then that's something that could be done overnight that would help a lot of housing insecure people. So
That's right.
Yeah. Just one thing, throw it out there. Yeah, fair enough. Well, we are going to adjourn to outside, so if you guys want to chat and talk, we are available. So thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everybody.